Chapter 5, Journey to the Cave. It was the middle of the afternoon by the time Caleb and Stephen hiked their way north through the woods along the creek to the entrance of their hidden cavern. By now, the two brothers had made the hike nearly a dozen times, and they knew the trail well, having left tiny little marks on the rocks and trees as guideposts of where to make the required twists and turns. Most of the trip required negotiating densely wooded forests with a few occasional creeks and meadows before they would reach the place near the side of a small hill where they found the entrance to the cave months ago. All along their trail were scattered old dead trees of all sizes, some still standing, others laying on their sides, with new tree growth all around them. Father told them that most of the homes, buildings, and large trees in this area were destroyed in the great flood that followed immediately after Anna I crashed into the ocean. Then, after Anna II crashed into Europe, the skies darkened, and winter came for many, many years. Once the weather began to warm up again, it didn't take long for new growth to begin. They had left the camp nearly an hour earlier, when Caleb, who had been holding the fishing poles and some of the equipment for most of the way, decided it was a good time to rest before continuing. He stopped and carefully laid his fishing poles against the side of an old, decayed log as he sat down on a rock to rest. "Stephen, would you?" Caleb paused and coughed slightly as his throat suddenly was very dry. "Would you hand me the water flask, please?" he asked with a raspy voice, reaching for the water flask his brother Stephen had been carrying. Caleb quickly popped the lid open on the flask, taking a huge gulp of water from the container while simultaneously wiping some of the sweat from his forehead with the edge of one of his sleeves. Caleb pulled the pack of equipment off his back and set it down on the ground near the rock where he was sitting, when he heard a distinctive clanking sound coming from the backpack. "What on earth did you put in here?" Caleb asked, realizing that it had been a much heavier load today than in past trips. "It's really heavy today," he complained. "Oh, I just packed a few extra things for our trip," declared Stephen. Stephen seemed preoccupied, barely noticing Caleb as he pulled his pack off and began shuffling through its contents. "There are so many things down there we still haven't looked at yet, and I want to." He paused as he noticed Caleb out of the corner of his eye chugging the water down. "Hey there, take it easy. We need to make that last." Caleb, growing curious about the noise from his pack, reached in and pulled out the large iron end of a pickaxe, his eyebrows raised up as he glanced up at Stephen. "I thought we were supposed to go fishing today, brother," he chuckled as Stephen quickly grabbed the axe, carefully returning it to the pack on the ground. "It seems you forgot the handle," teased Caleb. "At least I hope you remembered the candles this time?" Caleb asked. "I won't need the handle for what I'm using it for," explained Stephen. "And yes, I brought candles too. You ready to go on now?" he asked, somewhat impatiently. Caleb nodded his head, stood up and carefully slung the pack over his shoulders, as if realizing why it was so heavy before, now made it just that much more burdensome to carry. Caleb watched Stephen as he swiftly turned around and continued his way, following the trail once more. Stephen was still a good 10 inches taller than Caleb, although Caleb had been rapidly catching up with him over this last season. Caleb also noticed just how much his brother Stephen was starting to resemble their father as he aged. If it ever came down to a foot race between the two of them, Caleb would win hands down. However, if it were ever a contest of strength, Stephen would clearly be the winner. The two brothers continued following the trail for several hundred meters through the woods when they came upon a large clearing near the side of a creek. Stephen paused and took note of several large boulders that he had placed weeks earlier as a marker of where to cross. As soon as his brother Stephen stopped to take a drink, Caleb took this as an opportunity to do some sightseeing. This clearing was the first place where a person could get an unobstructed view of the surrounding countryside. Following the creek to the west, Caleb could see a small ridge rising about a half-mile away that marked the place where they had found the cave. On occasion, as Caleb and his brother made their fishing trips to the river, they would see strange and often eerie reminders of the people who had once lived here long ago in these woods. A rusted-out machine, or scattered blocks of stones that had once been the foundation for a home, or even the occasional large steel frames sticking out of the ground, some bent and twisted while others left intact. They had seen many similar things during their travels over the years from the Southlands. Their father and Joseph Daniels had warned them as children to expect these reminders of the people who once lived here in the past. Most of the time during their journey from the Southlands, they followed the old roads that had been built hundreds of years before. Great roads which crisscrossed the land for many miles. Mother had told them stories about the people that had once lived here and how they used to travel in motorized vehicles. Vehicles that moved faster than any horse could possibly go. Caleb could still remember the first ancient city that he had ever seen. They had passed through it about 2 seasons ago as they were traveling northward. He remembered seeing huge derelict rusted skeletons of buildings rising high into the sky, some which had fallen to the ground during the heavy ice and snow that covered the land for many years, while some remained as if beckoning for their human occupants to return. Their teachers, Mrs. Daniels and Mrs. Rickton, had also told them the story about how that same ancient city had once been nearly burned down hundreds of years before, in a different cataclysm of sorts, something she called the American Civil War. Caleb wondered what it would have been like to live in such places, hearing the roar of the old machines and the thousands of people living all around him. Caleb had taken advantage of this pause in their journey to inspect one such artifact that remained just a few dozen yards from the side of the creek, a mysterious object that puzzled him before, but they never stopped long enough to get a closer look. "Now what do you think this was, Stephen?" asked Caleb, gently kicking part of the object that was still half buried in the long narrow embankment of mud and sand next to the creek. The largest part of the object was a rusty wheel about 2 feet across, connected to a twisted frame with 2 smaller wheels behind. It looked similar to many of their horse-cart wheels, or the machines that they had seen rusting along the roadway, but this one was different than anything Caleb had yet seen. "It was called a tricycle," answered Stephen. "It's a toy that children used to play on, like a bicycle, but with 3 wheels instead of 2. Caleb's eyes widened as he thought about what might have happened to the children that once played on this tricycle. A few years before, when Caleb was younger, several men had worked for several days to restore an old bicycle that they pieced together from old parts they had found. It was difficult for the young Caleb to ride it since the bicycle was so much bigger than he was at the time. Stephen had told Caleb it would have been easier to ride if they would have had tires, but since rubber was scarce, they made do with pieces of rope and cloth wrapped around the rims in place of tires. It worked very well. However, Caleb never got a chance to try it because one of the older boys, Kevin Tobbs, decided to take it out for a joyride one day. He took it straight down a hill, smashing it into the side of a ravine. Tobbs spent several weeks with a cast on his left arm and was badly scraped up by the accident. Stephen told Caleb he felt that Kevin deserved it because he was always trying to show off for the girls. Caleb just wished he could have had at least one chance to ride it. As Caleb and Stephen approached the base of the ridge near the cave entrance, Stephen stopped suddenly, staring at the ground in front of him. From where Caleb was standing, he could not see what Stephen was staring at, or he might have better understood the unexpected pause. "Is everything okay up there?" Caleb asked. He heard a low grumble from his brother, who was now in a low squat, carefully inspecting the ground in front of him. Caleb waiting a few seconds for a response, but since patience was never his strong virtue, Caleb coughed slightly. "I said, is everything okay?" Stephen turned around from where he stood, moving his upper body but not his feet to face Caleb, and whispered in a low voice, "I've just found some new tracks." A slightly startled Caleb began looking all around and behind him to see if there were any more tracks, or perhaps see what or who had made them. Much to his relief, he saw nothing. "That's just great. What kind of tracks are they?" Caleb whispered back, trying to get more clarification from his somewhat vague brother. "Are they human or animal tracks?" From the time he and his brother were both able to walk and go exploring, their father Uriah had spent hours training them both on basic hunting and tracking techniques. Caleb knew, if anyone could figure out what kind of tracks they were, it would be his brother Stephen. They're human tracks. For a second, Caleb was somewhat relieved. The thought of wild animals running around these woods, with just the 2 of them out here alone, made him feel uneasy. Caleb reached down with his right hand to his side where he kept his knife sheathed, caressing the handle gently until the realization set in. Human? Maybe they're just our own tracks. Just then he realized how stupid that suggestion sounded. It had been several weeks, and a few rains ago since they were last out here. Any tracks would have been washed away by now. No, these are fresh prints, just in the last day or two, concluded Stephen, as he carefully poked around the tracks with the long walking stick that he carried with him all the time. And there were at least 4 of them. One had. Stephen paused as he poked the tracks some more with his stick. One of them had big feet, about Dad's size. The other 3 were smaller. Caleb watched in silence as his brother Stephen followed the tracks, carefully noting the direction they were moving and number of individuals who made them. It looks like they were heading north, Caleb noted. It must be a group from the McNeil clan that Peter was telling me about this morning. Stephen nodded in agreement. Maybe it is, but whoever they were, they're gone now. Keep your eyes open all the same. Stephen instructed, returning to the path they were following to the cave, all the while searching carefully up and down the ravine for any signs that they might have company. We certainly don't want anyone else finding out about our cave, Stephen reminded Caleb, as he continued once more to the base of the ridge where the entrance of the cave was, which was not too far from where they found the tracks. Stephen reached down and pulled the makeshift panels of branches, grasses, and leaves that the 2 of them had made months before, away from the entrance. Last fall, shortly after they had arrived, the 2 brothers had literally stumbled upon the cave by accident. Caleb clearly recalled the day that he and Stephen made their discovery on one of their trips to the river, just a few weeks before the first snows of the season arrived and caused everything to freeze up everywhere. It's quite possible, thought Caleb, that if they hadn't have found it then, they certainly wouldn't have been able to until now, since everything has started growing up even more with this early warm spring. Caleb was the first to reach the door, climbing down a short set of concrete steps to reach the first door to the underground chamber. It was partially rusted away. Stephen had told Caleb that it was probably due to the floods which came 3 years ago, which would explain why it was easy to open in the first place. However, it was the second doorway a few feet inside the main entrance that took the most time for them to open. It seemed that this door was intended to stay sealed and locked, but for some reason, perhaps in the builder's haste, there was no lock placed on the door. Once Caleb stepped into the main chamber, he set his backpack down and reached in and pulled out several candles and his mother's small oil lamp they had snuck along, setting them down gently on one of the large metal crates that were stacked neatly around the perimeter of the room, using the tiny amount of light that came through the doorway. Caleb carefully lit each of them and then moved them around to get more lighting evenly spaced inside the dark chamber. It was a small room, a little larger than Caleb and Stephen's tent, nearly 30 feet long and about 8 feet wide. The doorway they had come in was the only way in or out of the chamber. Caleb stepped back a few feet after he lit the oil lamp and candles and took a deep breath of air. The chamber had the most interesting smell. Caleb imagined that it was the paper from all the books stacked around the room, which gave the room that peculiar smell, a cross between pine wood and the oil that everyone used to burn in their lamps. As soon as his eyes adjusted to the light, Caleb began searching through the books. Reaching back into his backpack and pulling out the books he brought from camp to trade for new books on the shelves. Caleb found some familiar books stacked amongst the offerings, but mostly he found books he had never heard of before. Remember, Caleb, we can only take so many books back to camp with us, Stephen reminded Caleb. And we have to watch the time. We promised Mother we would be back before sundown. We also have to catch some fish, added Caleb. That's right, we do. While Caleb was busy looking over all the books, trying to decide which ones he would want to bring back to camp, Stephen grabbed the pack that Caleb had been carrying and pulled out the pickaxe he brought. Stephen's curiosity had reached its apex with these locked crates, and he was determined to find out what was inside them. The books and reading materials were all easily accessible within the chamber, stacked neatly around the front and rear of the room, while the locked metal crates were stacked on top of each other and placed neatly against the opposite sides. The interior of the chamber was very neat and clean, as if everything inside it were brand new, like it was on the day when they locked everything away inside here. Stephen had explained to him that it was because the chamber was tightly sealed, just like all the crates. They had even made several attempts to open the crates during their earlier visits, but these crates were all sealed very tightly and each one was locked with a solid metal lock. They were also quite heavy since it took two of them to lift one up. There must be important stuff in these, thought Caleb, for them to be put away so carefully. The two of them had decided there was no way they could bring any of this back to camp without more help. Stephen randomly chose the smallest and lightest crate to attempt to open first. It was one of the upper crates with a large red plus sign on the top. Stephen wasn't sure, but he vaguely remembered something about this being a symbol of some sort that stood for medicine or first aid that had been used in the past. Stephen carefully took the pointed end of the pickaxe he held in his hand and used it to wedge between the lock and the crate, banging and pulling on the end of it to get some leverage on the lock. The noise made Caleb stop his book search. "You know, they can probably hear you all the way back at camp." "I can't help it," Stephen continued pounding and pulling as hard as he could, but none of his efforts seemed to be working. "Trying to get this lock off here somehow." "You didn't happen to bring a hammer, did you?" Caleb asked sarcastically. Stephen stopped his pounding and glared at his brother. Caleb grinned, knowing the answer already. "Help me lift this crate off here and set it down on the floor," Stephen ordered. The two young men each grabbed one end of the crate, which had small, recessed handles built into each side, lifted the heavy crate off of the top of the one underneath, and then set it gently down on the floor. "This one seems to be the lightest of them all," added Caleb. "That's why I chose it first," explained Stephen, who was examining the crate meticulously. "Now, Caleb, you hold onto the crate and keep it from moving around, while I get up on top of it and kick the end of the axe down with my foot." Stephen moved around to the other side of the crate and climbed on top as Caleb held on as tightly as he could to keep it from moving around. Stephen began kicking downward on the top of the axe as hard as he could. The noise of Stephen's efforts boomed through the small chamber as he continued kicking as hard as he could, repeatedly. Caleb was just about to yell to his brother to stop when he noticed the locking mechanism beginning to loosen up around the top. "You almost got it, Stephen," Caleb yelled out. Suddenly, as Stephen gave the axe one more kick, the lock mechanism gave way with Stephen tumbling to the side of the crate, landing hard onto the floor of the chamber. Almost immediately, not missing a beat, Stephen twisted around on the floor, quickly shoving the lock aside to open the crate. "Caleb, grab the oil lamp and bring it over here a minute so we can get a better look." After opening the tightly sealed lid of the crate, Stephen reached in and picked up one of the small plastic cases that had been neatly packed within. He opened it up to see what was inside. Several small plastic bottles fell out of the case and onto the floor, along with an assortment of things that Stephen and Caleb had never seen before, but somehow Caleb knew immediately the importance of their find. The crate was neatly packed with an assortment of first aid supplies. Caleb noticed the lid of the crate had writing on it as Stephen collected the spilled items from the opened box. Caleb began to read aloud. "First aid container number 1, contents, 10 large mobile medical first aid kits, 10 medium kits, 2 dozen assorted boxes of Band-Aids, aspirin, sterile gauze." As Caleb continued reading the list, he paused when he reached an unknown word, "and 1 solar charger kit and portable defibrillator," stuttered Caleb, stumbling over the last word. He gave his brother Stephen a confused glance. "What's a portable defibrillator?" "I'm not exactly sure," quipped Stephen, shaking his head. "But we're going to have to get this stuff back to camp somehow." Suddenly they heard a noise coming from outside the chamber. It was the sound of men talking, several men loudly speaking all at once. Caleb and Stephen looked at each other nervously while Stephen held up the index finger of his left hand to his mouth, made a shushing sound, then quickly snuffing out all the lamps, he tiptoed quietly over to the entrance of the chamber to get a better view outside. As Stephen and Caleb crawled slowly up the steps, they could see the source of the voices. There were 3 adult men and 1 boy about 11 or 12, standing in the sunlight roughly 70 to 80 feet from the entrance to the chamber. Caleb strained to listen in on their conversation as it continued. "I'm tired, Dad. Can we go home? We've been out here all day and we've only caught 3 rabbits, complained the young boy, pulling on the shirt of the tall man Caleb assumed to be his father, as the other 2 men continued their separate discussion. Simon, I told you we had one more place to check out just up the river. After that we'll head back home," scolded the father, who seemed more concerned about examining the status of the woods around him than he was about the conversation the other two men were having. Caleb gently nudged his brother Stephen with his elbow. "Stephen, look, they have crossbows," he whispered. Stephen nodded his head and leaned in closer to Caleb, keeping his voice low. "I think they've been hunting down by the river." "Stay quiet, let's hope they leave soon." Stephen strained his ears to catch the discussion the other two men were having. It appeared from their conversation that these were some of the men from the neighboring clan that they had been hearing about and were most likely spending their afternoon hunting small game for food. Most of the clans they had met crafted their own bows or crossbows for hunting, and many hunters had become quite skilled with them. As Stephen slowly inched his way up the steps of the chamber to get a closer look, he clearly caught the last part of the conversation. "We need to start heading back to camp, boys. Some of the folks out east of here have been telling us to be on the watch for a group of people they ran into, the scavengers they called them. A mean bunch. We don't want to stray too far from the camp, and besides, it's getting late." The two other men finished their conversation and began walking slowly towards the northwest, following the river as they went. The older man and his son followed along behind them as the father continued examining the woods as they went. Caleb and Stephen watched them silently from the entrance of the cavern for several minutes as they left. "Did you hear that, Stephen? Who are these scavengers they're talking about?" whispered Caleb. "I don't know, but we better finish up here and start heading back home ourselves. Grab one of those large bags from the crate, put it in your backpack, and let's take it back home with us." Stephen turned around and stopped suddenly, nudging Caleb in the leg. "Come on, let's hurry," he emphasized. Stephen then continued carefully backing down the steps to the chamber and back inside. Relighting the lamp once again, he began putting their things back into their packs. Caleb followed his brother's instructions, grabbing one of the large medical bags from inside the crate and stuffing it into his backpack. When Stephen had his back turned away, he grabbed a few other items he had noticed in the crate and added them to the contents of his pack. "I'll look these over later," he thought. "What do you suppose might be in these other crates, Stephen?" Caleb asked, gesturing towards the other unopened crates that were still lining the chamber as he was busy securing his backpack. "I have no idea. We'll have to come back for those some other time." Stephen paused and looked at all the crates as he thought, "I wonder what other surprises you have in store for us."
You have been listening to Caleb Elgin, The Rise of the Clans by David E. Farmer. Also available on Amazon Kindle. More chapters coming soon. Thank you for listening. Have a great day. Bye-bye.